Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be tackling the topic, the human genetic load. And specifically, we're going to be asking the question or answering the question, are we spiraling to extinction because of the accumulation of deleterious mutations in humans? I want to begin this by answering the question, no, we are not spiraling to extinction because of the accumulation of deleterious mutations. I want to begin by answering this question because I don't want to even lead you any further into thinking that the answer to this question could be anything other than no. We're going to go a little bit into the history of this, and I think then you'll kind of see why it's so important to come down hard on this question. Um, but first, let's think a little bit about where the question comes from, where the idea comes from. So I managed to find this image from the Australian Museum. Apparently, this is actually an exhibit, as dark and morbid as it is. The article is titled, "Do We Know How Some Early Human Ancestors Died?" And this is from a skull from an early hominin that showed bite marks from a big cat, right? It's showing that they were killed, they were eaten by a big cat. I bring this up because I'm a person that wears glasses. Without glasses, I could not see 15 yards in front of me. On the African savannah, I would have been eaten by a leopard or another big cat really, really easily because there would have been no way I would have seen them coming. Um, and so, therefore, my bad eyesight would have probably been removed by natural selection, right? We wouldn't have expected individuals with eyesight as bad as mine to have persisted for very long. But the threat of predation by big cats is not something that has persisted into the modern age. I can wear glasses, and that completely corrects whatever mutation that I might harbor that allows my eyes to be bad or that makes my eyes bad, right? Since I can wear glasses, I can see just as well as anyone else. And since I can overcome any fitness disadvantage because we live in an age in which there isn't one, right? And so the idea, kind of the popular idea, is that, oh, well, these little fixes like glasses, other sorts of medical intervention, etc., all they're doing is prolonging the inevitable. We're allowing these deleterious mutations to begin to accumulate, and we're just like addressing them with medicine, but eventually they're going to be so bad that we're just going to spiral to extinction, right? That's the idea of the human genetic load. Um, and so that's to just kind of get us started of the basic idea, the basic claim. And so what I want to do first is talk about the history of this concept. I'm going to read to you some pretty dark things about this idea, where it originated. So be warned, some of the things you're going to hear are going to be pretty dark. And I think it's very, very important to begin this conversation with that history. Because if we don't start with that history, we don't know why talking about it in the way we do today is just as problematic as it was then. So we really, really need to understand that history. Then we'll introduce what it is theoretically. What is the theoretical population genetic definition? How do we understand it? And then I'll give a little application in terms of like deriving the expected amount of function in the human genome. Then we'll talk about what's the context of mutational fitness effects, which is very, very important to this whole idea of genetic load, is the context of those mutations. And then finally, we'll circle back to how it applies to humans. And sort of the impetus for this was this particular paper by Mike Lynch. He is a famous population geneticist. I've read lots of his work. Most of the things that he's written, I admire, I really enjoy, but this particular paper jumped out at me as very problematic. It's titled "Mutation in Human Exceptionalism: Our Future Genetic Load," and he basically makes the argument that I just made, right? About when I was talking about eyesight, how there's going to be an accumulation of deleterious mutations in the human population, and it will eventually spiral us towards extinction, right? That's the nutshell argument that he's making in this paper. He also gives some particularly problematic like policy recommendations in terms of like thinking about how we should deal with this. And we'll get to that. So first off, this paper came out in reply to Lynch's article, but instead of taking a more theoretical approach, they drive home the importance of understanding the history. And so what I want to do is read to you some excerpts from this paper, because I think it's very, very important, like I said, to understand this history. This is by Amir Taysher. They begin this article thusly: today we possess, and this is quoting someone else, today we possess numerous examples, not only of transmission, but as well of hereditary accumulation of morbid predisposition to mental anomalies. These are the words of LFE Renadin, director of the mental asylum at Marville, in his 1859 medical psychological studies on mental alienation. So this is obviously written in 1854. This is before we had any conception of Mendelian genetics. This is before Darwin published Origin of Species. So like before we really even thought about evolution in any way that we think about it today, the idea that there could be something bad, some kind of negative predisposition towards mental or physical abnormities were passed on through family lines, right? So this idea is old, is the point of me going through that. He also talks about someone else, Benedict Augustine Morel's treatise on the physical, intellectual, and moral degeneracy of the human race. This was published in 1857, again, 2 years before Darwin. He writes, for Morel, degeneracy was a process of progressive mental, physical, and moral deterioration from one generation to the next, whose initial impetus may have been external, such as poor nutrition, living conditions, etc., but whose influence was inherited, and whose ultimate result was the production of imbeciles and the annihilation of entire familiar stocks. Again, this is the exact idea of genetic load, right? That these sorts of like malformities will accumulate in the human population, and that they're passed on from generation to generation. And he goes through in this article and talks about various other societies that had the same idea. So this is from Talbot, 1898. This is in America, studies on quote unquote social degenerate families. An investigation into degenerate heredity by various prominent scientists, ostensibly furnish the links between crime, poverty, alcoholism, and mental deviancy, and help to frame social problems as inherently biological ones. He further goes on to write that the British polymath Francis Galton, who was Darwin's half-cousin, proposed the term eugenics, to define the means and methods to be mobilized for taking control over human evolution and for redirecting it towards a better path, whether by checking the reproduction of those deemed less fit or by boosting the propagation of those who were of higher quality. So again, if we think about what this means in terms of the genetic load, it's the idea that, okay, if we recognize these deleterious mutations are accumulating, what can we do to stop it? Well, this subset of people have more, these subset have less, so we always select those that have the less number of these deleterious mutations so that they can propagate and better the human genetic stock, right? That's effectively what eugenics was proposing, and continues to propose to this day. They go on to write that, as in the case of the American eugenics movement, the underlying agenda informing these works was that families with members displaying mental illnesses, and not only the mental ill themselves, needed to be socially isolated and their reproduction stemmed, right? Which is what I was just talking about. Note that a lot of this is about mental illness, particularly in these early writings. It's a lot about how mental illness is leading to things like poverty or crime, etc. That it's all about these people are somehow less mentally capable because they have an accumulated genetic load. They go on to write, the research program talking about eugenics became institutionalized in Germany when in 1917, Rudin was appointed director of the Department of Genealogical and Demographic Studies in the newly established German Institute for Psychiatric Research. Throughout the 1920s, German psychiatrists were therefore instructed to advise their patients not to procreate, and also to warn potential marriage partners not to marry into quote unquote sick families by conveying their audiences the relative dangers and not the absolute ones to their future progeny. So going a little bit further, continuing on German history, we all know where this is going, right? We know already, if you've taken any history, you know where this is leading to. But I think it's important to note that the seeds of this history were founded in the 1850s, right? This idea has persisted for a long time. So continuing on in this article, for example, at the end of a talk given to the members of the Society of Gynecologists in Munich in 1930, the psychiatrist Hans Luxemburger exclaimed that, quote, "Our nation and the future of our culture cannot tolerate for long the present load of the mentally ill." The mentally ill individual was, quote, "like a parasite, draining strength from the financial and mental powers of his surroundings, creating stress on social and financial standards of his siblings." Furthermore, he stated that a radical eugenic measure would therefore be a continuous, unmerciful hospitalization of all the hereditary mentally ill, eventually in big colonies where they would build a state within a state. So he goes on to write that hence from January 1934, German citizens with mental or physical defects began to face hereditary tribunals that decided whether or not they should be sterilized. According to current estimates, hereditary courts discussed around 436,000 cases between 1934 and 1945, and their decisions led to the sterilization of roughly 300,000 individuals. Furthermore, during World War II, greater than 70,000 mentally and physically handicapped were murdered by starvation, lethal injections, and gassing in the Nazi quote-unquote euthanasia program. There is no ambiguity here where this link comes from. This is not a straw man. There is a very clear link. There's a continuous link from the 1850 concept, first introduced, maybe not even first introduced, but first discussed in this medical psychological book, all the way up to the Holocaust and the fallout of the Second World War. The rise of eugenics, the rise of Mendelian genetics, all the rise of Mendelian genetics did was give like the science to the eugenics concept, to the concept that there was some sort of degeneracy in these family lines that needed to be purged. So how does all of this eventually get tied into population genetics? We've been talking about sort of psychiatry and politics and sort of the history of the eugenics movement, but obviously it arose from some kind of population genetic underpinning. And this leads us to the important 1950 paper by Muller called Our Load of Mutation. So I'm going to continue from this article. How is all of this relevant to Muller's 1950 Our Load of Mutations? According to the narrative favored by geneticists, it isn't. However, according to Muller, the relaxation of natural selection in modern society would, quote, ultimately lead to an ever greater heaping up of mutant genes. Muller goes on to write, there would be no limit to this short of the complete loss of all of the genes or their degradation into utterly unrecognizable forms, differing chaotically from one another, from one individual of the population to another. Our descendants' natural biological organization would in fact have disintegrated, and have been replaced by complete disorder. Their only connections with mankind would then be the historical one. it would, in the end, be far easier and more sensible to manufacture a complete man de novo than to try to refashion into human from the pitiful relics which had remained. That's a pretty dark indictment of the future of human genetics, given the way that Muller saw it. The author here points out that Muller was an opponent of Nazi eugenics, that he did publicly denounce Nazi eugenics, as well as the eugenic movement in America, for their racism, crudity, and compulsory nature, because the eugenicists wanted to force people to be sterilized. Muller alternatively thought that people should just volunteer to be sterilized. Quote, he advocated social and economic equality as necessary preconditions for any attempt to voluntarily apply eugenic measures, but he never truly gave up his hopes to refashion society along genetic principles. As he saw it, quote, the odious perversions of the subject should not blind us longer to a set of hard truths that cannot be permanently ignored or denied without ultimate disaster. It's just a way to try to make it sound a little bit better, right? I'm not saying that we should force anyone to be sterilized, that the government should force people, but ultimately, if we don't take this into account, right, then it will lead to our ultimate disaster. Again, this goes back to what I said in the very, very beginning. Are we just spiraling to extinction? Right. This is exactly what Muller was saying. This is exactly what the eugenicist was saying. This is exactly what the guy in the 1850s was saying, that there's a continuous thread. It's not novel. We've been saying this for a long time. And so with that, I want to now kind of transition into the way that we think about this in a population genetic framework. So firstly, there are several types of genetic loads that are defined in population genetics. Several of these loads were actually derived by J.B.S. Haldane. The mutational load, which is the one that we're kind of talking about here, was first derived in 1937 by Haldane in The American Naturalist, The Effect of Variation on Fitness. And this is the way that he defined it. So we can think about load simply as L, which is the load, is equal to the max fitness, so the highest fitness of the best individual, minus the mean fitness of the population. All right, so that is the load. What is the difference between the best genotype and the average genotype? So for a recessive mutation, where the selective disadvantage is larger than the mutation rate, Kimura in 1961 showed that you can actually approximate this load as the mutation rate itself. And subsequently, then the average fitness of the population should be equal to 1 minus that mutation rate raised to the number of loci that could be mutated, right? So let's think about this and let's put it to an application so that we can kind of understand the concept here. So let's think about it as the mean fertility of a population, which is equal to F bar. And you can think of that as the mean number of offspring born per individual. And that is thus F equals to 1 over W bar, where W bar is, again, the mean fitness of the population. So what's the implication for this in terms of human genome functionality? Okay. Can we derive some idea about how much of the human genome should be functional given a measure of the load that it would have to deal with? So human genome size is 3 billion base pairs. If all mutations are deleterious, so we're discounting neutral and we're discounting beneficial mutations. And we're going to assume that they're recessive because that makes the math a little bit easier. And that the rate is 10 to the negative 8 per individual per generation. Okay. Then we can calculate the load as equal to the number of bases times the mutation rate, right? And that just equals 30, and that is equal to 30. So that's the load. There's 30 deleterious mutations that are accumulating in every single individual in every single generation, right? So, and that's again, that's assuming that all of those bases are functional, right? That all of those bases are capable of having a deleterious mutation. So the assumption here is that the entire genome is functional, all 100%. All right. So therefore, the mean fitness of the population is 1 minus the mutation rate raised, because remember that's what we derived before, 1 minus the mutation rate raised to the number of loci that are possible to be mutated. And that leads to a mean fitness of 9.36 times 10 to the negative 14. So really, really small mean fitness, right? Therefore, what can this mean realistic? Like if we can put some numbers that we can actually like intuit as meaning something, let's think about what that means for the mean fertility of the population to be able to maintain a constant size, right? Remember that the human population is actually growing exponentially. So it's not even that we're maintaining a constant size. The human population is exploding in size. So if the whole genome is functional with a load of 30 and a mean fitness of 9.36 times 10 to the negative 14, the mean fertility to maintain this population would have to be 1.07 times 10 to the 13. That's how many offspring that each individual would need to have on average to maintain the population size. That's obviously a preposterous number. That number is greater than the human population size, right? So for a given mutation rate, assuming that these mutations are recessive and that the whole entire genome is functional, each individual would need to have more offspring than currently exist as individuals on the planet, right? It's preposterous. It's an absolutely ridiculous number. A more realistic measure of the genetic load in humans was acquired by Kitely and Ira Walker in 2000, and they produced a measure of the load as being 0.78, right? So obviously much less than 30. And we can actually use this measure to gain some kind of intuition for the functional fraction of the human genome, and we'll call it X. Okay, so if the load, so all we're doing is rearranging the equation. This is the load. It's equal to what we want to know, the number of base pairs that are capable of having a deleterious mutation, right? And those are by definition functional. Non-functional regions can't have deleterious mutations because they're non-functional. You can change them to anything. It doesn't hurt the organism, right? So X then, the little x, represents the number of base pairs capable of mutating into something bad. So times the mutation rate, we just do a little algebra, rearrange it, and that gives us 7.8 times 10 to the 7. That's million base pairs that are capable of mutating to something deleterious. Thus, the fraction of the human genome that can be functional under this, fairly simplistic model is 7.8 times 10 to the 7 divided by the total genome size, which equals 0.026. That's 2%, just under 3%, right? Obviously, much less, and that produces a load that is tolerable by any standard. We can maintain a constant population size if less than 3% of the genome is capable of mutating into something deleterious. If you think about what this means, there's just under 2% of your genome is protein coding, right? So what this could account for is both protein coding and some regulatory sequences, right? And again, this is very simplistic, back of the napkin calculation. Don't take this as like absolute. It's more about like, can we get an intuition of just how much of the genome can be functional given the load that would accumulate per base pair per generation, and how many offspring you'd have to be able to counter that, right? So that's just an example of how this kind of calculation has been used in the literature. This particular calculation comes from Dan Grauer. He's got a paper on human genome functionality in which he kind of uses this cost of selection sort of argument. Okay, so now we've talked about the eugenics history of the concept of mutational load. We've given how it's actually used in PopGen, which in the modern day, thanks to people like James Crow, diverge pretty significantly from how it was used historically, as just like these are discrete definitions that don't say anything about like human mental health or human like their physicality or anything like that, right? It's just a measure of mutation accumulation, and it's often being applied to things like conservation, like populations of conservation concern, right? So those are the two steps we've been through so far. Now let's think about something that's critically important to this whole idea about a human mutational load, and that is mutational context. Okay, so this is what's called a distribution of fitness effects. On the x-axis is the relative fitness effect of every de novo mutation, a brand new mutation. If it's 0, then the fitness effect is null, it's neutral. If it's greater than 0, then the fitness is beneficial. It's a beneficial mutation. If it's less than 0, then it's deleterious. This is pretty representative of most DFEs that I've seen estimated in nature. They're slightly less skewed. So most mutations are slightly deleterious. But wait, what does that mean exactly? What does it mean for a mutation to be slightly deleterious or to be neutral or to be beneficial? Like what's the context in which this matters, right? So every single one of these mutations, they have some fitness effect, but that effect is dependent on the environment in which they're arising, right? So I want to give you a very simple example to hopefully drive this point home. So imagine two climates. You have a cold climate and a hot climate. And we're interested in tracking some hypothetical population of wolves that live across these two climates, okay? And they have a single allele that determines whether they have long fur or short fur, right? Now, if that mutation arises, let's say a mutation going from long fur to short fur, so big A to little a, if that arises in a cold climate, that's a deleterious mutation, right? That's a bad mutation because you are now less able to deal with the cold. However, if that arises in a hot climate, it's a beneficial mutation, right? So it's very dependent on the context, whether you're in cold, whether you're in hot, whether you're mutating to big A or to little a, in which one of those environments, that's the context that matters, right? So while this just seems like an absolute measure, it's still very context dependent. Okay, now with that background, let's return to Lynch's paper. And let's see if we can then apply some of these ideas to the problem that Lynch brings up. And a lot of this goes back to my initial introduction to this when I talk about wearing glasses. Okay, so let's see how this excellent paper responded to Lynch. This paper is taking exceptions to human eugenics, and these are two fabulous population geneticists, Frederick Roth and John Wakeley, and they really take Lynch to task. And so I wanted to read some excerpts from this paper. They write, "We are concerned with the perspective article Mutation and Human Exceptionalism by Lynch. It opens a dark chapter of eugenics without clearly reading it as a cautionary tale. Given the history of eugenics, especially high standards for scholarship, sensitivity, and attention to historical context are needed when discussing the complex issues surrounding human genetic improvement. Statements similar to those that Lynch make in his article, which in the 1920s and 30s were being made by leading population geneticists, led directly to eugenic policies and were later readily attached to the genocidal programs of Nazism. Failing to engage with these issues or offering vague recommendations invites misappropriation by those who wish to see the return of these aggressive eugenics." So I read that just to make it very clear that I am not just like taking Lynch out of context, okay? The responses to Lynch's paper by other population geneticists like myself also came to this conclusion, that it maybe not overtly eugenics, but was definitely eugenics adjacent. And it's very important that we address it and respond to it in kind. And in their paper, they point out exactly this importance of mutational context when it comes to thinking about human genetic load. They write, quote, most surprising was Lynch's failure to consider the environment in which fitness should be measured, or to consider that the fitness that matters most to humanity is fitness in present and future environments. Remember, it doesn't matter that I can't see. I have glasses and I'm not being hunted by big cats. The present environment, that the mutation that I have that gives me bad eyesight in the present environment is not deleterious because it doesn't affect my fitness, right? It doesn't lead me to being eaten by cats. It doesn't prevent me from finding mates or getting a job or succeeding or surviving, right? It literally has no impact on my fitness. So Lynch lists, quote, removal of visual acuity issues by optometry, which is why I bring this up, as a medical intervention that may eventually reduce the fitness of humanity. How ridiculous is that? But as James Crow put it, quote, who worries about having to wear spectacles? While myopia may have had an important fitness cost in Paleolithic times, glasses are now widely available and seem likely to remain so. Of course, for other disease traits, increased prevalence might come at greater cost. However, many medical interventions may become less costly over the time frame of decades to centuries that Lynch considers. Again, if we think about someone that's born with a genetic defect that prevents them from doing something, but we have medical treatments that allows them to then do that thing, that mutation ceases to be bad because they've overcome it. It no longer impacts their fitness. In exactly the same way that I can see just fine, we have overcome that mutation. If you think about that distribution of fitness effects, we have taken mutations that would have been deleterious in a different setting, and we've shifted it to neutrality, where it no longer hurts us in the present setting. Now, sure, you could come up with some apocalyptic scenario in which all of modern civilization collapses and now we're basically back to the Paleolithic age. Yeah, but like that's a ridiculous thing to assume is going to happen, or a really, really poor excuse for thinking in eugenics terms, right? So again, the nail in the coffin, the take home message of this is that mutations are context dependent. You cannot say that humans have an increasing genetic load because of medical intervention. No, though that medical intervention is shifting the fitness effects of those mutations to neutrality, meaning that they are no longer deleterious. I know I'm repeating myself, but I can't stress that enough. They cease to be deleterious when you can just change their fitness effects by wearing glasses, right? So I know that was a lot, and I want to give Roth and Wakeley the last word on this because this is, again, an excellent rebuttal to Lynch's idea, and I think an excellent rebuttal to this idea as it exists in popular culture. So I'm going to read this very last part and just give them the last word. The burden of proof was wholly on Lynch to support his thesis that contemporary medicine, family planning, and other modern practices are likely to dangerously reduce the fitness of the human population. Lynch failed to meet this burden of proof on multiple points. Lynch holds that his conclusions are similar to those which others had arrived at previously. Indeed, every point Lynch makes, including his concern about increases in the mutation rate and his call to focus on mental capacity, can be found in the articles he cites by Muller. Muller, which I read to you previously, and Crow 1997 hold important ideas worth reading. However, reiterating their concerns without the important caveats they discuss seems reckless. And sometimes in places, an agreed upon mandate to pursue eugenics has been present with disastrous outcomes. We urge Genetics, which is the journal in which Lynch published, to establish clear policies requiring that any article touching on human eugenics, e.g., one that entertains strategies to alter human allele frequencies through procedures that do not clearly benefit the recipients, do so with the highest level of rigor, sensitivity, humility, ethical perspective, and historical context. Otherwise, eugenics is a chapter best left closed. Thank you so much for being here, for listening to this. I hope you learned something from this. And the next time someone tells you that the human population is spiraling to extinction because of this genetic load, refer them to this video or tell them, hey, that's just a eugenicist talking point that doesn't actually make biological sense. Thanks.